Nylon dreams, nylon riots. While that script about brightness and turnover was settling in, another miracle marched onto a stage in Queens. 1939, the New York World's Fair. DuPont unveils nylon, the first fully synthetic fiber with a line that stuck, stronger than steel by weight, sheer as a spider web, and ready to change wardrobes forever. The crowd loved it. By 1940, nylon stockings hit stores and sold out almost instantly. For millions of women, they weren't just fashion. They were freedom from pricey, fragile silk. Then the war swallowed the miracle. Nylon's greatest traits, strength, stretch, resilience, made it perfect for parachutes, ropes, nets, and cordage. Factories pivoted to the military. Stockings vanished from shelves and people improvised. There are wartime photos of women painting seams down their legs with eyebrow pencil, a small hack to keep up appearances when nylon went to the front. The message was patriotic sacrifice, not commerce. When the war ended, the lines began. Manufacturers promised nylon would return to civilian life, and demand came back like a wave. In May 1945, Pittsburgh's Kaufman's department store announced a shipment. 10,000 pairs gone in hours. Police were called as the crowd surged. Newspapers called it a nylon riot. 2 months later in Chicago, at State and Madison, a similar scene. Long lines, frayed tempers, and street brawls over hosiery. In 1946, stampedes in New York and Philadelphia made front pages. Stockings were scarce, tempers were high, and the product's reputation was now bound to social order. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Pre-war promotion pitched nylon stockings as both glamorous and tough. No more runs, more wear between buys. But post-war, consumers started noticing something. Ladders and snags seemed more common than the brochure had promised. There were technical reasons to point to denier changes, finishing tweaks, rushed scale up. But on the sales floor, a rumor took root. The strength had been dialed back. Fragility meant repeat customers. We don't have a memo that says, weaken the thread. We do have a market incentive and contemporaneous reports of increased sheerness and runs. The same language that softened the lightbulb shift reappeared. Ads leaned on sheerer, smoother, more natural look. Sheer often means thinner filament or lower denier. Thinner means more delicate. The face changed, the logic didn't. Sell aspiration on the front, schedule the replacement in the weave. Meanwhile, production realities met marketing promises. Wartime equipment retooled for peacetime wasn't at steady state. Consistency wobbled. If you bought 3 pairs, one might last, one might snag first wear, and the third would run after a week. Women didn't need a lab to detect a pattern. They had their budgets and their laundry baskets. The trust built on that World's Fair stage began to fray. A micro story from that summer. A secretary in Chicago saves ration points and cash through the war, expecting to celebrate peacetime with one indulgence, a pair of nylons. She joins the dawn line at State and Madison clutching coffee. When doors open, the crowd shoves. She's jostled to a counter, triumphs with a box, and walks home smiling. 2 days later on the L platform, a run zips down her calf before the train arrives. She shrugs and buys mending fluid that afternoon. That shrug is the moment the industry wins. Technically, the fiber story is nuanced. Nylon's performance depends on denier, twist, finish, and knit. A stocking that resists runs can feel heavier and look less invisible. The post-war push favored ultrafine appearance. Ads sold appearance, not survivability. That choice wasn't sinister by itself, it was commercial. But when the crowd scenes turned violent and the disappointment showed up in letters to editors, a deeper doubt surfaced. Were we chasing beauty or being trained to accept breakage? The riots did more than make headlines. They wrote a lesson for boardrooms. Scarcity creates desire. Desire forgives flaws once, then desire needs managing. If quality drifts down while marketing dials up, you need throughput. More shipments, more launches, more limited drops. The riot becomes the ad. Retail managers remembered how fast a single delivery could clear shelves. Forecasting spreadsheets learned to translate controlled availability into guaranteed sell-through. Parallel to that, hosiery counters became laboratories for blame. Sales clerks were coached to ask how customers laundered their nylons, whether they wore rings that could snag, if their shoes had burrs by the heel. The script displaced cause from fiber decisions to user behavior. Meanwhile, mending kits and run-stop, liquids appeared within arm's reach of the stockings. Another small revenue stream built around a failure baked into the product category. What nobody knew at the time was how far this garment story would travel. The hosiery aisle taught 2 core moves: promise with one attribute, compromise another, then frame the compromise as elegance. And when the crowd complains, point to technique, not design. It's the same mindset that later treated sealed batteries as sleek, non-removable backs as rigid, and proprietary screws as precision. In the aftermath of the riots, supply stabilized, quality found a range, and the panic faded. But a cultural switch remained flipped. Consumers walked away believing two things at once. Nylon was a marvel, and marvels were finicky. That belief made it easier to accept shorter cycles across categories. If miracle fibers snag, maybe miracle gadgets stutter. If stockings need constant replacing, maybe phones do too. The nylon saga didn't just sell hosiery. It trained us for a century of controlled fragility. The right to repair was a right. It was a threat. From nylon aisles to gadget counters, one idea kept paying: make replacement routine. But there was a problem for that plan: people who fix things. Repair culture breaks the sales calendar. So companies started rearranging the product itself, not to deter thieves or protect safety, but to make fixing harder, slower, and more expensive than buying new. Start with the small stuff. Screws became glue, clips turned into welds. Batteries, once a 2-minute swap, vanished behind heat-sealed glass and adhesive that fought back like tar. Ribbon cables got rooted under components, so a single crack meant a full disassembly. Precision construction sounded elegant. It also meant you'd snap a connector before you desave a phone. Then the software arrived. Parts began to carry ID numbers that devices would authenticate. A screen from one iPhone wouldn't just need the right size, it needed the right handshake. Replace a camera or a home button and the phone might boot with a polite scold, unable to verify this is a genuine Apple part. Function could degrade, features would gray out, or warnings would linger until you gave up and booked a genius bar. It wasn't a conspiracy theory, it was code. Legal language closed another door. Warranties sprouted stickers, void if removed, and end-user license agreements reframed ownership. Buy the machine, lease the brain. The phrase, "you don't own the software," became the hinge. If you don't own the thing that tells the hardware what to do, someone else decides when your perfectly fine motor, pump, or display is unsupported. Compatibility became a moving target synced to quarterly roadmaps. Farmers felt this before most of us. John Deere tractors rolled out with onboard computers that controlled everything from fuel mix to fault codes. When a sensor tripped, the machine could limp to a halt. The fix, dealer software, and a service call. Owners discovered they'd bought a license to operate a vehicle they couldn't legally repair beyond bolts and bearings. Independent mechanics found their tools obsolete overnight. A harvest window doesn't care about EULAs, but the combine did. Walk down a city street and you'd see the human fallout. Independent repair shops, once the neighborhood's troubleshooting brain trust, started running into walls. A laptop hinge fix needed a plastic frame that a manufacturer wouldn't sell. A tablet battery replacement required a heat gun, solvent, and luck. Parts pairing meant even genuine components salvaged from donor devices could trigger errors. Shops either specialized in micro-soldering and board-level wizardry or closed their gate. A few turned into e-waste triage stations, stripping devices for the few pieces that weren't serialized. Corporate communications offered a clean script: glued batteries for thinness and water resistance, proprietary screws for precision and safety, locked diagnostics to protect users and the environment. If you believed them, third-party repair was chaos. Only authorized service could guarantee integrity. But the pattern rhymed with older stories. Every barrier also rooted money back to the seller. Every safety claim seemed to arrive just when repair started eating into accessories and replacements. Here's a micro story. A college student cracks a phone screen a week before finals. The local shop has a replacement on the bench in 20 minutes. The phone boots, but Face ID is gone. A warning nags every hour. She studies through pop-ups until morning, then books the official repair anyway. 2 fixes for 1 break, 1 customer trained to avoid the cheaper door next time. The economics stack up fast. If a battery is sealed, you replace the device when capacity sags. If storage is soldered, your slow laptop is a full swap, not a $60 drive upgrade. If a printer rejects third-party cartridges, you pay subscription ink prices that eclipse the machine's value by year 2. The upfront tag looks friendly, but the lifetime cost hides in adhesives, flags, and log files. And there's a cultural cost. Repair used to be a kind of literacy. Parents showed kids how to replace a belt on a vacuum or restring a lamp. Those small wins built confidence and attachment. When you glue a product shut and lock the diagnostics, you erase that bond. The object becomes a rental with a countdown, not a companion you maintain. Meanwhile, manufacturers didn't just harden devices, they hardened supply. spare parts lists shrank. Service manuals moved behind portals. Training required non-disclosure agreements that barred techs from telling customers what failed and why. The line from the Swiss lab to the strip mall was clean. Control measurement, control messaging, control the moment of replacement. But there was one problem with that control. It depended on software. And once software governs whether your hardware deserves to work, a new lever appears, the remote switch. That's where the fight over repair spills into the next chapter, because now a battery can be fine, a motor can be solid,
software
and a line of code can still hardware can last. Software decides if it's allowed to. That's the new lever, invisible, updatable, and enforced at scale. When code sits between you and a perfectly good machine, the business model doesn't need a wrench, it needs a patch. Here's where it clicked for millions of people at once. Late 2016, iPhones that felt fine yesterday suddenly felt tired. Apps hesitated, animation stuttered. The story from forums sounded like deja vu. Performance dropped right after an update. In January 2017, Apple shipped iOS 10.2.1 with a quiet feature. Performance management for iPhone 6, 6 Plus, 6s, 6s Plus, and SE, later 7 and 7 Plus. No pop-ups, no setting to toggle, no explanation at install. The idea, Apple said after the fact, was to prevent unexpected shutdowns as batteries aged or ran cold. The result was throttling, CPUs slowed, responsiveness dulled, without telling users why. Only when independent testers graphed processor speeds against battery health did the pattern show. Lawsuits followed. Apple offered discounted battery swaps, paid a $500 million settlement in the US, and took a 25 million euros fine in France for failing to disclose. The devices weren't dying. Management code was kneecapping them based on an internal threshold. What nobody saw on day one is how powerful that threshold is. Once performance ties to an unseen health score, software becomes judge and jury. Your phone can feel obsolete while the silicon is fine. Replace the battery and the speed returns, which tells you what really failed. Transparency. Printers learned this trick years earlier. In 2016, HP pushed dynamic security firmware that rejected third-party cartridges overnight. One update later, printers flashed error codes and refused to print with chips they didn't recognize. HP's defense sounded tidy: security, quality, protecting users from counterfeit consumables. Customers saw a lock on a staple good. Lawsuits landed across countries. Refunds and apologies trickled out. Then the company repeated the move in later updates. Epson faced suits over error codes that stopped machines despite visible ink. The pattern matched the bulb lab, only now the lab was in your router and your consent was a checkbox. Version sunsetting adds another quiet gate. Apps and operating systems drop support for older versions, then cut off security updates, then block installs from stores. A working tablet becomes a web browser that can't log in. A smart TV's streaming app expires because the service no longer supports that build. The hardware hasn't cracked. The cloud calendar says it's time. For your safety and to maintain service quality, do the rhetorical lifting. Ownership turns conditional. Smart homes make it feel personal. A hub fades when the company sunsets its servers. A thermostat loses remote features when a cloud API retires. Speakers turn stubborn when an authentication certificate lapses. The frustration isn't where, it's policy. One morning you wake up and the thing you bought needs the company's permission to keep being itself. Micro story: a teacher sets up a classroom of low-cost tablets for literacy practice. Over summer break, the reading app vendor ends support for the OS version the district can afford. In September, the login screen spins. A patch exists if the tablets can update. They can't. The lesson plan changes not because glass cracked, but because an endpoint moved. Under the hood, the enforcement tools have names: parts pairing, device attestation, key revocation, license checks. Replace a battery and a message warns unable to verify. Swap a camera and a function grays out until a server blesses the repair. Try a third-party cartridge and firmware checks a cryptographic signature before a nozzle fires. Try to keep using an old client and the server demands a minimum version. None of this is science fiction. It's standard practice in industries that discovered recurring revenue hides in authentication. Corporate language stays consistent. Apple framed throttling as protection from shutdowns. HP framed ink locks as printer security. Smart home vendors frame bricked hubs as end-of-life for legacy platforms. The safety story matters sometimes truthfully. A phone that restarts mid-call is bad. Malware in a printer can pivot into a network. Unsupported code can be dangerous, but look at the incentives. A battery swap is cheaper than a phone. Third-party ink undercuts a subscription. Supporting old firmware costs money without driving new sales. The knife cuts along the revenue grain. Consumers adapt in small, heroic ways. Some hold back updates, hoping to preserve function longer. Others jailbreak, flash alternative firmware, or block domains that push unwanted code. Forums trade hashes of good versions like recipes. But the wall rises. Offline modes require online check-ins. Encryption binds features to user accounts. Secure enclaves validate parts at boot. The door that used to be a hinge is now a server. There's an environmental undertow in all this. A laptop that loses OS support but still has a healthy battery and screen becomes a closet trophy. A printer that rejects ink lands at a recycler with a perfectly good mechanism. A thermostat with a dead cloud becomes e-waste with a temperature sensor inside. When function tracks a contract instead of physical wear, the dump gets younger, faster. Here's the twist that loops back to Geneva. The Swiss lab counted hours to enforce a 1,000-hour life. Today, telemetry counts cycles, health scores, error states, and serial numbers. The measurement isn't the villain, secrecy is. If you showed people the thresholds, let them choose a battery swap over a slowdown, offered an offline mode when a cloud retires, the control would shift. But secrecy keeps the calendar hidden and the reorder predictable. Meanwhile, regulators are waking up. France's Repairability Index pushes manufacturers to disclose parts availability and fixability. Right to repair bills target parts pairing and manual access. Class actions and fines don't rewrite code, but they make companies ask a harder question before flipping the switch. If software is the new lifespan, who gets to set the clock? Standards, patents, and the gatekeepers of longevity. Standards sound boring until you realize they decide how long your stuff lives. After throttling and firmware locks, this is the upstream layer. The rules written in committee rooms that quietly tilt choices toward faster turnover long before a factory line spins up. While that was happening in software, engineers were sitting in standards meetings debating trade-offs that looked technical but landed economic. A lumen per watt target outruns filament robustness. A thinner battery profile slips under a design spec even if it has cycle life. On paper, those moves read like progress: brighter, lighter, sleeker. In practice, they steer a market toward parts that wear out on a schedule. The trick is subtle because nobody writes make it fail. They write optimize for efficiency, then let the physics do the shortening. Here, S where the language matters. Best available efficiency becomes a procurement checkbox. Once it's baked into a recommended practice, suppliers build to it because bids demand it. A municipal buyer thinks they're buying greener bulbs. The unseen cost is tighter life dispersion around a number that flatters spreadsheets. When the spec ignores dispersion and only lists an average, clustering failures gets rewarded with predictable maintenance interval. Convenience becomes the fig leaf for fragility. Patents amplify the tilt. A chip that authenticates genuine consumables isn't just IP, it's a gate. Lock the protocol, claim security, and third-party parts vanish, not because they're unsafe, but because the handshake is proprietary. The result looks like quality control and feels like a toll booth. In printers, that chip decides if ink moves. In appliances, a board reads a sensor's ID before a pump spins. The mechanism is the same. Embed ownership in silicon, then rent trust back to the buyer. Licensing closes the loop. If a manufacturer controls a diagnostic protocol through IP and licensing fees, small suppliers can't afford to join. They ship generic parts without the handshake and devices reject them. Meanwhile, big buyers negotiating volume discounts have no reason to push for openness. The system works for them. The long tail, the shops that keep things alive in year 7, gets cut off by fees upstream, not just glue downstream. Meanwhile, something else was happening in trade associations. Lobbyists packaged these choices in public interest wrapping. Safety and efficiency did the heavy lifting in white papers. When regulators asked why products seemed harder to fix and quicker to replace, the answers came with charts. Lower energy use, higher lumen output, thinner profiles that saved materials. True in isolation, misleading when the lifetime curve shrinks and e-waste swells. It's the old bulb story, rewritten in standards language. Micro story from a spec room. A battery working group debates envelope thickness.